Thanks for being a part of the Apologist bookshelf. Gary Zacharias here. I'm back for another look at an older book by D. James Kennedy and Jerry Newcomb called What If Jesus Had Never Been Born? I already covered one part of the book that discussed care for the poor and how that was a real Christian idea that gained traction. I want to do chapter 13. It's called Amazing Grace, Lives Changed by Jesus Christ. They start with a quote from Paul. Therefore, this is 2 Corinthians 5, by the way. Therefore, if anyone is in Christ, he is a new creation. Old things have passed away. Behold, all things have become new. So I thought this was a great way to start. It said in the 19th century, so some time ago, there was a man named Charles Bradlaugh. He was a prominent atheist, and he challenged a Christian man to a debate about the claims of Christianity. The Christian name was, it was Hugh Hughes. Can you imagine going through life? Hugh Hughes. Anyway, he was an active soul winner working among the poor in the slums of London. So Hughes told Bradlaugh, I would agree to the debate on one condition. We each bring some concrete evidences of the validity of our beliefs in the form of men and women who've been redeemed from terrible lives by the influence of our teaching. I'll bring 100 such men and women, and I challenge you to do the same. Hughes even said later that, well, if Bradlaugh couldn't bring 100, how about 50? If he couldn't bring 50, he could bring 20. Finally, he whittled it down to one. All Bradlaugh had to do was to find one person whose life was improved by atheism. And Hughes, remember Hughes said he'd bring 100 people improved by Christ, would agree to debate him. Bradlaugh withdrew. Isn't that something? The point that they're bringing here is that people are not improved by atheism unless they so define that as abandoning a twisted form of Christianity that really isn't Christianity at all. And so this chapter is actually introducing us to people who have been made so much better of changing people's lives. They start by going back to the New Testament. Think about Zacchaeus. He was a tax collector. Wow, that was a job, huh? You know something about that. Tax collectors were despised. They were given protection by the Romans, but they were Jews who were taking money from the Jews, and whatever was left over they could keep. And so, of course, they would charge exorbitant rates. They also mentioned Mary Magdalene. How about the Apostle Paul? They mentioned the change of Paul in his life. Boy, did things go completely different for him after his conversion to Christ. Then he moved up a little bit in time. Augustine of Hippo, the greatest of the Latin fathers. He was called the last major thinker of the ancient world and the first philosopher and theologian of the Middle Ages. So he wrote something called Confessions. That was his classic work about his pre-Christian and his post-Christian experience. And he spelled out the sins and debauchery of his former life. He said, I will now call to mind my past foulness and the carnal corruptions of my soul, not because I love them, but that I might love thee, O my God. So when Augustine was 16, it says he seldom lost an opportunity to pursue one sin or another. He had sex out of wedlock, fathered a son prior to his 20th birthday, but he had all these arguments against Christianity, and they were refuted, and he became a Christian in 386 A.D. He heard a child's voice say, take up and read. And so he saw a Bible, I guess, a portion of Scripture nearby, and he read from it. He came across Romans 13:14, which said this, put on the Lord Jesus Christ and make no provision for the flesh to fulfill its lusts. Well, that really knocked him over because that was his life. And so he had an amazing conversion and became one of the most important thinkers of all time. Here's somebody I'd never heard of before, Francis Xavier, 1506 to 1552. He was born to an aristocrat, and he was basically a Parisian playboy. Apparently he was charming and witty and athletic and good-looking and conquered a lot of women, and he was pretty vain. But then he met a devout Christian named Ignatius Loyola, and gradually Xavier became disappointed and bored with his lifestyle, and he was talking to Loyola, who said to him, there's a great quote, I guess Loyola said, look in Matthew 16:26, and here's what Loyola said to him. These are the words of Jesus. What shall it profit a man if he shall gain the whole world and lose his soul? And it said that really entered him big time. And Xavier gave his life to Christ then. Ended up being one of the greatest missionaries in the history of the church. He ended up adopting the customs, so whoever he was among, and trying to get them to listen. And he's now viewed as the inspiration of modern Catholic missions. Then we move a little further along. How about John Newton? Not Isaac, right? John Newton, no relative. And this would be the 1700s. He's the one, of course, that wrote Amazing Grace. And he knew what God's grace was all about. He actually worked in the slave trade before he was converted. He was making money dealing with ships trading in human cargo. Well, he was at sea in 1747. There was a terrible storm, and he called out to God, protect me, and he was spared. Now, he didn't give up the slave trade immediately, but he did because of his Christian convictions a few years later. Ended up a pastor. He was a pastor to William Wilberforce. Now, he's the evangelical that led the fight in Parliament against the slave trade. Newton was a great friend and inspiration in Wilberforce's long struggle to try to get the British to give up slavery. A recent USA poll says Newton's testimony and song Amazing Grace ended up being America's favorite hymn. And boy, the first four lines of that are powerful, aren't they? Amazing grace, how sweet the sound that saved a wretch like me. I once was lost, but now I'm found. Was blind, but now I see. That's every Christian story, isn't it? How about Mel Trotter? Here's another man who has changed big time. He was terrible. He was the scum of the scum. He abused his family, neglected his kids, fired from jobs. He ended up drunk in a gutter someplace. One day he came home and found his little daughter was pretty sick, and he grabbed her shoes and went out and sold them for a drink. Came home, found out she was dead. He was so remorseful at that point. He was going to end his life. He was going to throw himself into Lake Michigan. And as he trudged down the street, he could hear someone preaching over a loudspeaker. He stepped into the building's doorway and heard a man talking about Jesus who loves sinners. And he said to himself, can it be there is anyone who could love someone like me? He just stood transfixed by that message. And because of that, he's set free. He later established a mission for people who are down and out in Grand Rapids, Michigan. He established 50 more missions around the nation. Tens of thousands of drunks and terrible individuals had their lives transformed by Christ through him. Wow, that's good. And then there's C.S. Lewis. In the 1900s, one of the greatest writers, a professor. His mother had died. He had a skeptical tutor who taught him to think critically. He became an atheist early in life. He was wounded in World War I and came out of that thinking there's nothing worth pursuing besides just pleasures of the flesh. But what got to him is that some of his favorite writers, including George MacDonald and G.K. Chesterton, were Christian. And then he talked to some Christian people, including, you'll recognize this name, J.R.R. Tolkien. And it was kind of a reluctant conversion. He was probably the greatest Christian writer of this century and one of the greatest Christian writers in all Christian history. Time magazine ended up doing a cover story on him, and his books are still selling so well, and it's used by thousands of people to bring people to Jesus. Chuck Colson acknowledges that C.S. Lewis's classic book, Mere Christianity, was pivotal to him in his change. How about Sergeant Jacob de Chazer and Captain Mitsuo Fuchida? All right, well, who are these people? De Chazer was a bombardier in General Doolittle's squadron. And when he was bombing Japan one time, his plane got hit with anti-aircraft fire, and he and his crew bailed out and survived. And they got tossed into a prison camp, treated with awful cruelty by the Japanese guards. He just wished day after day he could grab one of them and kill him. His hatred grew. It was just bitter. But one day a Bible was brought into the prison and finally came to him, and he read it. And he came across the words of Jesus. Father, forgive them, for they don't know what they do. That's Luke 23. Well, that love of Christ for people who are killing him, putting him on the cross, melted that hatred and filled him with the joy of Jesus Christ. He said, my heart was full of joy. I wouldn't have traded places with anyone. So he said, he just thought about love your enemies, even though they were beating him and doing all sorts of things. And he came home after the war, but he prayed about it, and he thought God wanted him to go back to Japan, not for revenge, not to grab those people and choke them to death, but to be a missionary. And so he came back home. He came back to Japan. And they wrote up his story in a tract. And one day there was a Japanese man, who was feeling really depressed, and he was disheartened, and he was broke. And he was given that tract, and he read it, and his heart was touched. He sought out Christian missionaries and the Bible, and he was converted. And his name, Captain Mitsuo Fuchida. He was the Japanese officer who spearheaded that attack in 1941 on Pearl Harbor. He's the one who declared Torah, Torah, Torah. He gave his heart and life over to Jesus. He began to preach the gospel. He even came back to Pearl Harbor with a gift in hand for the survivors. He gave them Bibles with that Luke reference, Father, forgive them. He asked for forgiveness. It's a great story. There's a book, I guess, God's Samurai, and that's Fushida's story. Okay, what about this one? There's a story of a man named Chief Tariri. Who's this person? It says there was a New York World's Fair about 30-some years ago, and they had something called the Tower of Light. Beautiful, just lights on, just brightness never seen before. You could see it up to hundreds of miles away. And the person that lit the switch that lighted that tower had been thrown by someone from South America. Now, not, you'd think it'd be maybe the leader of the country, or a well-known physician from the country, or a sports star, or whatever. He was a Peruvian headhunter. Wow. He was the chief of a whole tribe of headhunters. His name was Chief Tariri. He was so fearsome, he had personally killed and decapitated other chieftains, plus just a bunch of common jungle Indians. And the heads of the ones that he had killed and decapitated decorated poles in front of his hut. Even the Peruvian army was terrified of him. They wouldn't go into his territory at all. But there were two young Wycliffe Bible translators. All they had was pen, pencil, Bible, and they went into the jungle, and they went into his camp. But for some reason, they were expecting probably to be killed, but the chief looked on them with favor. They were appearing as no threat, and so they showed him a love that he'd never seen before. They began to speak to him about the one who had loved the world that had never been seen like that before. Took them all the way to the cross. Finally, the heart of this headhunter was softened by the power of the gospel of Christ, and he yielded his life to the Lord. He led about 200 of his fellow tribespeople to Christ. He's the one that pulled the switch. So pretty interesting, right? He was in darkness, and the light came to him, and so he lit that tower of light as well. Of course, here's a famous one that we would know far better, Chuck Colson. He was known as Nixon's hatchet man when Nixon was in the White House. He was a high-powered attorney. He was a go-go kind of guy. He was no saint, right? Anything went. If you wanted to do dirty tricks on the enemy, do it to him. And his book, by the way, I read it a long time ago, is interesting. It's called Born Again. Yeah, it's a really good book. So he comes off as kind of a jerk. So listen to what a colleague of Colson said about him in those pre-conversion days. This comment comes from another person involved with Nixon and Watergate and all, Jeb Stuart Magruder. Magruder was part of the committee to re-elect the president. Here's what he said about Colson in 1974. I came to regard Colson as an evil genius. His brilliance was undeniable, but it was too often applied to encouraging Richard Nixon's darker side, his desire to lash out at his enemies, his instinct for the jugular. I would have to say, granting always Nixon's central responsibility for what happened in his administration, Colson was one of the men among his advisors most responsible for creating the climate that made Watergate possible, perhaps inevitable. Well, Colson became a Christian. What's his story? Well, after that, Colson headed up a ministry he started called Prison Fellowship, preached the gospel to tens of thousands of inmates. It's now a worldwide outreach. It's located in Virginia, helped more than 100,000 prisoners a few years back. I don't know what they've been doing lately, but I imagine it's just grown, even though Colson passed away. It ministers to people in prison, helps them get readjusted, help them get back into society, helps their families. They do Christmas gifts for the families of inmates. And of course, he's had some wonderful books. In fact, I think I've done podcasts on 2 or 3 of his. One's called The Faith, and How Now Shall We Live, and maybe one more, I can't remember. But he had a radio commentary called Breakpoint. Now that's taken over with John Stone Street, and it's just an amazing thing here. So those are just some of the lives that have been changed, just unbelievable differences in people's lives. So let's see, I'm looking at the end of the book here. There's another chapter, but I think I'm going to wait on it. It's a chapter that I'll just give you a little heads up on. It's called A Cruel World. What happens when Christian restraints are removed? So you just heard stories of people who became Christians and had their lives turned in a 180 and became completely different people, became wonderful people because of that change. But this chapter, which we'll do next for my next podcast from the book, is what happens to life without the hope of the Christian message. Well, you get Nietzsche, you get atheism, you get moral relativism, a devaluation of human life, you get crimes against humanity, right? We get slaughters like in the 20th century. It's been some awful stuff that's gone on. So anyway, I'll leave it at this, but this is, again, D. James Kennedy and Jerry Newcomb. What if Jesus had never been born? Just to give you an idea, I think this is pretty funny. There's a cartoonist named Johnny Hart. He does BC. He said, what if Jesus had never been born? Well, for openers, there wouldn't be this book, which, by the way, is wonderful. Buy it before you open it, or you'll still be standing here when the store closes. That's a good one. So I like the book, and it's an older book, obviously. Let me check the date on this. Wow, 1994, 30-year-old book, and then some. But these things don't go out of style. It talks about things, like I said, I've done a chapter on taking care of the poor. That was because of Christianity. Let me just mention a couple of the other chapters. Christianity's impact on the founding of our country, Christianity's contribution to civil liberties, science, economics, sex and the family, education, the value of human life. I think I'm missing a couple here, but let's see what else. Art, impact on morality, health, medicine, arts, music. So Christianity these days is being accused of being evil. Absolutely not true. It's done some amazingly wonderful things for the world. Okay, well, I appreciate you being part of this podcast, and thanks so much, and we'll do another one soon.